The smoke from the first strikes had barely cleared over Tehran when the real story began to take shape. Not in the rubble of Iranian nuclear facilities, not in the corridors of the Pentagon, and not in the breaking news alerts that lit up screens across the Western world. The real story was unfolding quietly, thousands of miles away, in the boardrooms of Beijing and the war rooms of Chinese strategic planners who had been waiting for exactly this moment. While America's military machine turned its full attention to the Persian Gulf, China did what China has always done in moments of great power confrontation. It watched, it waited, and it moved. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched large-scale coordinated strikes against Iran, beginning what would become one of the most consequential military campaigns of the decade. The operation was called Operation Epic Fury. The stated aim was the dismantling of Iran's nuclear program and the degradation of its military infrastructure. Bombs fell on hardened bunkers. Missile batteries were silenced. The strikes were precise, overwhelming, and by most military measures successful. Washington declared it a victory. President Donald Trump called it strength. And in that moment of American confidence, Beijing saw something entirely different. It saw opportunity. CNN's Fareed. Zakaria observed that China's reserved reaction to the U.S. military action against Iran showed a nation playing a long game, one that had managed to position itself as the indispensable power during the resulting global disruptions. That assessment was not rhetorical. It was rooted in a series of concrete developments that began unfolding the moment the first Tomahawk missile left its launch tube. For Chinese leaders, the intermittent cycle of contained escalation between the United States and Iran served Beijing's objectives directly, increasing the strategic cost of Washington's posture in the Gulf, distracting it from confronting China in the Indo-Pacific and slowly depleting its military and financial resources. This was not accidental. Beijing had studied Washington's strategic overextension for years. The Iran war handed them a live demonstration, the military dimension of what China gained without firing a single shot is staggering. Before February 28, the United States held approximately 2,300 JASSM-ER cruise missiles globally. By early April 2026, the Pentagon had fired over 1,000 of them and committed most of the remaining stockpile to CENTCOM bases and RAF Fairford in the United Kingdom. The JASSM-ER, the Joint Air-to-Surface Standoff Missile Extended Range, or MAIT, is not a peripheral weapon. It is the precision strike backbone of American air power, the weapon the U.S. Air Force built its post-Cold War strike doctrine around. Approximately 425 serviceable JASSM-ER missiles remained worldwide as of early April 2026, enough to arm 17 B-1B bombers for a single sortie. One sortie, then gone. The U.S. Navy had also fired more than 850 Tomahawk cruise missiles in the war with Iran, prompting alarm inside the Pentagon and urgent discussions about how reserves could be replenished. Sources told the Washington Post that Tomahawk supplies had reached levels described as alarmingly low. In 4 critical munitions categories, the Iran campaign was drawing down stockpiles that would be indispensable in any future conflict in the Pacific. The math was brutal and simple. Every Tomahawk launched at Iran was one less Tomahawk that could be used against China. Every JASSM fired into a hardened bunker outside Isfahan was a JASSM that would not be available over the Taiwan Strait. Defense analysts warned openly that China might see the depleted American missile inventory as an opportunity to move against Taiwan. The assessment was not theoretical. It was a live strategic calculation being made in real time by military planners on both sides of the Pacific. But the military ledger was only part of the equation. The economic consequences of the Iran war were shaping the global order in ways that may outlast the conflict itself. The conflict allowed China to bolster its diplomatic leverage, expand its clean energy dominance, and gather critical intelligence on U.S. military capabilities, all without firing a shot or spending a dollar on the war itself. The Strait of Hormuz became the pivot point of this transformation. On an average day, the strait carries roughly 5.4 million barrels of oil to China from Gulf suppliers alone, more than double what China receives from Russia. The blockade created by the US and the ongoing conflict disrupted that flow. But China, unlike the nations scrambling to replace lost energy supplies, had already secured an alternative. Since 2021, Iran had been locked into a 25-year cooperation agreement with Beijing, securing $400 billion worth of oil at below-market prices in exchange for Chinese investment and security cooperation. Meanwhile, the energy disruption handed Beijing a gift in another arena entirely. As the oil and gas crisis set off by the war in Iran drove governments to accelerate their transitions to renewable energy, China stood as the dominant force in renewable energy supply chains, producing a vast majority of the world's solar panels, wind turbines, batteries, and electric vehicles. Nations that had depended on Middle Eastern fossil fuels and now found themselves stranded by the Hormuz blockade turned almost instinctively toward Chinese technology to fill the gap. Chinese exports of inverters, a key component in energy storage systems, surged 57% year on year as nations scrambled to build out energy independence in the wake of the crisis. The Trump administration, by contrast, was proposing massive cuts to federal funding for energy research and development, had decimated tax incentives for renewables and electric vehicles, and had coercively pressured trade partners to expand imports of American LNG. That approach, which leaned on diplomatic muscle rather than competitive pricing, made potential customers cautious. The war itself had cavalierly put the energy security of U.S. partners and allies at risk, and the coercive approach to diplomacy compounded that uncertainty. The Global South, watching all of this unfold, drew its own conclusions. China was reliable, China was affordable, China was there. As the war roiled global markets, Iran and China moved jointly to accelerate a shared strategic objective: the dismantling of U.S. dollar dominance in global trade. For years, both governments had argued that Washington leveraged the dollar's supremacy in international oil markets to exert coercive power over adversaries and competitors alike. The war created the conditions for that argument to gain real traction. Nations that had watched the U.S. weaponize the dollar through sanctions for decades now saw an American military campaign that had shut down one of the world's most important energy corridors. The dollar's role as the foundation of global oil trade, approximately 80% of all oil transactions, began to look less like an inevitability and more like a vulnerability. China maintained throughout the conflict that it was pursuing diplomatic mediation. It publicly condemned the U.S. and Israeli strikes, abstained from condemning Iranian attacks on Gulf states in the United Nations Security Council, and maintained limited material assistance to Tehran, including spare parts for missiles. But it committed no troops and engaged in no direct combat operations. It was the perfect posture. Morally oppositional to the war, strategically advantaged by it, and militarily untouched by it. The conflict illustrated an evolving pattern of indirect great power involvement in regional wars, where success increasingly depends on integrated technological ecosystems rather than direct military participation. China provided satellite navigation through the BeiDou system. It supplied radar technologies and electronic warfare expertise acquired through years of dual-use commercial exports. In April 2026, the Financial Times published an investigation citing leaked Iranian military documents showing that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Aerospace Force had secretly acquired a high-resolution Chinese reconnaissance satellite in late 2024, used to monitor key military sites across the region. Beijing denied the claims. The denial changed nothing on the ground. The weaker the Iranian regime became, whether from American and Israeli military strikes or from domestic unrest, the more diplomatically, economically, and technologically dependent on China it became. Every bomb that fell on Iran tightened Beijing's grip on Tehran. Every round of ceasefire negotiations that Washington stumbled through, posting Truth Social ultimatums, while Iranian officials publicly rebuffed the terms, made China look more stable, more credible, and more trustworthy to the governments watching from the outside. This is the paradox that Fareed Zakaria placed at the center of his analysis, and it is the paradox that the facts on the ground in April 2026 fully confirm. The United States went to war in the Middle East to project strength and enforce its strategic will. It struck with overwhelming force. It degraded Iran's military and its nuclear ambitions. By the traditional metrics of military power, it achieved much of what it set out to achieve. But in the wider arena, where great powers actually compete in the 21st century, in energy markets, in technology supply chains, in diplomatic credibility, and in the long-term balance of precision military stockpiles, the ledger told a different story. America burned through years of irreplaceable weapons production. China captured the global clean energy market. Russia filled the oil gap and collected a windfall. And Beijing, having never fired a shot, emerged from the wreckage, positioned as the indispensable power. The guns were American, the gains were Chinese. History will record that the two facts are not unrelated.